The morning of November 14th, 1944, near Aachen, Germany. First Lieutenant James Bates crouches inside his M4 Sherman tank, watching through the narrow periscope slit as a German Panther tank emerges from the tree line 300 yards ahead. The Panther's long 75mm gun traverses slowly, deliberately, searching for targets. Bates knows the mathematics of this encounter with absolute certainty. His Sherman's 75mm gun cannot penetrate a Panther's frontal armor at this range. The shell will simply bounce off the sloped steel like a stone skipping across water. But the Panther's gun can slice through his Sherman's armor as if it were made of tin. He has perhaps 15 seconds before that German gunner acquires him. 15 seconds to live or die. His hands are steady on the commander's override, but his mouth is dry. This is how most Sherman crews die, outgunned, outranged, outmatched. The Panther's turret stops moving. The gun barrel is pointing directly at him now. Bates opens his mouth to give the order to reverse, to flee, to do anything except sit here and wait for the end. And then the Panther explodes. Not from any weapon Bates fired, not from any gun he can see. The German tank simply erupts in a massive fireball, its turret lifting 3 feet off the chassis before crashing back down. Black smoke pours from every hatch. Bates stares, uncomprehending. Then he hears the sharp, distinctive crack of a 90mm gun firing from somewhere far behind him. A gun that, 3 years earlier, the United States Army Ordnance Department declared physically impossible to mount on a mobile chassis. A gun that one stubborn civilian engineer insisted could work, despite every expert telling him otherwise. This is the story of how Harley Earl's impossible gun transformed American tank destroyers from death traps into tiger killers at 1,000 yards. And it begins not on a battlefield, but in an office, where bureaucracy nearly killed more American boys than German shells ever could. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The spring of 1942. Aberdeen Proving Ground, Maryland. Major General Andrew Davis Bruce sits at his desk, reviewing casualty projections that make his stomach turn. The numbers are theoretical. The United States has not yet committed armor to large-scale combat in Europe, but British intelligence reports from North Africa paint a grim picture. German panzer forces are fielding new heavy tanks that fundamentally change the calculus of armored warfare. The Panzer Mark V, called the Panther, the Panzer Mark VI, called the Tiger. These are not the light and medium tanks that American doctrine was designed to counter. These are 45-ton and 54-ton monsters with thick, sloped armor and powerful guns. The standard American response, the M4 Sherman medium tank, carries a 75mm gun designed primarily for infantry support and engaging light to medium armor. Against a Tiger's frontal armor, the Sherman's gun is nearly useless at combat ranges. The British have already learned this lesson in blood. At the Battle of Gazala, a single Tiger destroyed 12 British tanks before withdrawing. The kill ratio in some North African engagements approaches 5 Allied tanks lost for every German heavy tank destroyed. General Bruce understands industrial mathematics. The United States can outproduce Germany 5-1, 10-1, perhaps even 20-1. American factories are already churning out Sherman tanks at a rate the Germans cannot hope to match. But Bruce also understands something. The production statistics do not capture every Sherman tank contains 4 or 5 American boys. Young men from Iowa and Texas and New York. Farmhands and factory workers and college students. The question that haunts him is simple. How many of them will die because their tanks cannot fight on equal terms with German armor? The solution seems obvious. The United States military already possesses an excellent heavy anti-aircraft gun, the 90mm M1. It fires a 24-pound projectile at nearly 3,000 feet per second. Against armor, it is devastatingly effective. Ballistic tests show that the 90mm M3 variant optimized for anti-tank use can penetrate over 6 inches of armor plate at 1,000 yards. That is sufficient to defeat a Tiger from the front. Sufficient to engage a Panther at ranges where the German tank cannot effectively return fire. But there is a fundamental problem. The M3 90mm anti-aircraft gun weighs 19,000 pounds. When it fires, the recoil generates forces exceeding 30 tons. It is designed to be towed behind a truck and emplaced on a fixed mount with outriggers and ground spades to absorb the massive recoil. The notion of mounting such a weapon on a mobile tank chassis seems to violate basic principles of physics and engineering. Nevertheless, General Bruce directs the Ordnance Department to investigate the possibility. The Ordnance Department is the United States Army's technical and procurement authority. It is staffed by experienced engineers, many of them career officers, who have spent decades designing and testing military equipment. They are methodical, careful, and deeply conservative in their engineering estimates. In June of 1942, they delivered their verdict. Mounting a 90mm gun on a medium tank chassis is not feasible with current technology. The report is 37 pages long and exhaustively detailed. The recoil forces would shatter the chassis unless it was reinforced to the point where the vehicle became immobile. The weight of the gun and its ammunition would overwhelm the suspension system. The turret ring would need to be enlarged to accommodate the gun's greater length and the larger breech mechanism, requiring a complete redesign of the turret structure. The ammunition for the 90mm gun is significantly larger and heavier than Sherman ammunition, reducing the number of rounds that could be carried and creating storage problems within the fighting compartment. The gun's greater length would shift the vehicle's center of gravity forward, creating stability problems. The crew would need additional training on entirely new fire control systems. The production retooling required would delay Sherman production for months, perhaps longer. Each of these objections is technically valid. Each is supported by calculations and engineering analysis. Taken together, they constitute what the Ordnance Department considers an insurmountable case against the project. General Bruce reads the report twice. He makes several notations in the margins. Then he picks up his telephone and places a call to a civilian engineer working on contract with the tank destroyer program. The engineer's name is Harley Earl. Harley Earl is not a famous man in the spring of 1942. He is 38 years old, stocky, with thinning hair and wire-rimmed spectacles that give him the appearance of a small-town accountant rather than an engineer. He shares a surname with Harley J. Earl, the legendary automobile designer at General Motors, but the two men are not related, and Harley Earl's work has nothing to do with sleek automotive styling. Before the war, Harley Earl designed industrial machinery, heavy hydraulic presses for manufacturing, conveyor systems for mining operations, equipment that dealt with massive forces and weights that had to function reliably under extreme stress. He specialized in what other engineers considered impossible or impractical, finding elegant solutions to problems involving the application of enormous force to structures that, conventional wisdom said, could not handle that force. In 1941, as the United States military began its rapid expansion, Earl was recruited to work on the tank destroyer program at Aberdeen Proving Ground. The tank destroyer doctrine was relatively new. Rather than engaging enemy tanks with American tanks, the doctrine called for fast, lightly armored vehicles, mounting powerful guns to hunt and destroy enemy armor. The first American tank destroyer, the M10, used a modified Sherman chassis with an open-topped turret to save weight. It mounted a 3-inch gun, 76.2 millimeters, which was more powerful than the Sherman's 75 millimeter, but still inadequate against the newest German heavy tanks. Earl had spent 6 months working on incremental improvements to the M10 when General Bruce handed him the Ordnance Department's report on the 90mm gun. Earl took the report back to his small office in one of Aberdeen's converted warehouses. He read it carefully over the course of 3 days, making notes on a yellow legal pad. The Ordnance Department's analysis was correct in its particulars. Each individual objection they raised was valid if one accepted their underlying assumptions. But Earl had built a career on questioning assumptions. On the 4th day, he began sketching. The central insight was this. The Ordnance Department had approached the problem by asking whether you could mount a 90mm gun on an existing tank chassis. Earl asked a different question. What kind of chassis would you need to design to accommodate a 90mm gun? The starting point was the M10 tank destroyer. It already used a modified Sherman hull with a more powerful engine and an open-topped turret. The open top was controversial. It left the crew exposed to artillery fragments and small arms fire, but it saved over £2,000 compared to a fully enclosed turret. Weight savings were critical. Earl began with the chassis. The M10's hull used the same basic structure as the Sherman, but Earl proposed additional reinforcements, thicker floor plates to distribute recoil forces, additional cross-bracing in the hull structure, upgraded torsion bar suspension to handle greater weight and shock. Each modification added weight, but each also distributed the enormous forces generated by the 90mm gun's recoil across the entire structure rather than concentrating stress at specific failure points. The turret presented the real engineering challenge. A conventional turret design would be far too heavy for the chassis to handle, but Earl was not designing a conventional turret. He sketched a low-profile, open-topped turret with a distinctive feature, a large, box-like bustle extending from the rear of the turret. The bustle served two functions. First, it acted as a counterweight to the long, heavy 90mm gun extending forward. The gun barrel and breech mechanism weighed over 2 tons. By placing ammunition, storage, and other equipment in the rear bustle, Earl balanced the turret's weight distribution. Second, the bustle provided the additional interior volume needed to store the larger 90mm ammunition. Each round was substantially bigger than Sherman ammunition, nearly 3 feet long and weighing over 40 pounds. The bustle could hold a basic load of 47 rounds. The gun mount itself was the most innovative element of Earl's design. Rather than a rigid mount bolted directly to the turret structure, he designed a hydraulic recoil system that absorbed roughly 40% of the firing shock before it reached the chassis. Long recoil cylinders allowed the gun to travel backward nearly 18 inches when fired, transforming the instantaneous force of recoil into a longer, more manageable impulse. The entire system was elegant in its simplicity. No single component was revolutionary, but the integration of all the components created something the Ordnance Department had declared impossible, a mobile platform capable of reliably firing a 90mm anti-tank gun. On paper, the design worked, but paper calculations and physical reality are different things. Earl knew that the only way to prove the design was feasible was to build it. In September of 1942, Earl submitted his preliminary designs to the Ordnance Department's review board. The response was swift and negative. The review board raised numerous objections. The design would be expensive to produce, requiring modifications to existing production lines. It would divert resources and production capacity from Sherman tank manufacturing at a time when Sherman production was considered the highest priority. The open-topped turret was deemed unacceptably dangerous for crew members. The design was unproven and represented an unnecessary risk when the M10 tank destroyer was already entering production. But Earl suspected the real issue was institutional. The Ordnance Department had spent considerable time and effort producing a report that declared a 90mm tank destroyer impossible. Approving Earl's design would require them to admit that their analysis had been incomplete or flawed. Organizations, like people, resist admitting error. Earl could have accepted the rejection. He was a civilian contractor with no particular authority or influence, but he had not survived in the industrial engineering business by accepting the word impossible when he believed something could work. He bypassed the Ordnance Department Review Board and appealed directly to General Bruce. Bruce reviewed Earl's designs and asked a series of pointed technical questions. Earl answered each one. Bruce studied the drawings for several minutes. Then he said 4 words that would change everything. "Build me a prototype." By December of 1942, Earl and a small team of engineers and machinists at Aberdeen Proving Ground began hand-building what the Army designated the T-71 prototype vehicle. They started with an M10 A1 hull, the diesel engine variant of the M10 tank destroyer. They reinforced the chassis according to Earl's specifications, adding nearly 3/4 of a ton of additional structural steel. They fabricated the turret in sections, welding and riveting the armor plates together around a custom-built turret ring. The 90mm M3 gun itself was adapted from an anti-aircraft mount, with Earl's hydraulic recoil system installed. The work was painstaking. This was not a production line assembly. Every component was custom fitted. Problems emerged constantly. The turret traverse mechanism was too weak and had to be redesigned. The ammunition racks did not fit properly and required modification. The gun breech interfered with the radio equipment. Earl and his team worked 12-hour days, 7 days a week. By early January of 1943, the prototype was complete. It was not beautiful. The welds were rough in places. The turret paint was mismatched. The bustle stuck out from the back of the turret like a rectangular tumour, but it was functional. On the morning of January 23, 1943, the T-71 prototype rolled under its own power to Aberdeen's Proving Ground firing range. The temperature was 12 degrees Fahrenheit. Ice covered the ground. Harley Earl stood 50 yards from the prototype with General Bruce and a delegation of Ordnance Department officers. The test crew, volunteers from the Aberdeen garrison, climbed into the vehicle. The gunner loaded a 90mm armor-piercing round. Earl had performed the calculations hundreds of times. He had checked and rechecked every weld, every structural member, every component. He was 90% certain the chassis would hold, perhaps 95%, but 95% is not 100%. If the chassis failed catastrophically, the crew could be injured or killed. The turret could be torn off the hull, the prototype could be destroyed, and Earl's career would be over. The gunner's voice crackled over the external radio speaker. "Ready to fire." General Bruce glanced at Earl. Earl nodded. The order came, "Fire when ready." For perhaps 3 seconds, nothing happened. Then the 90mm gun fired. The sound was extraordinary. Not merely loud, but physically overwhelming, a sharp, violent crack that echoed off the surrounding hills and seemed to compress the air itself. The entire vehicle rocked backward, its tracks sliding 6 inches across the frozen ground despite the weight of 29 tons. A cloud of dust and smoke exploded from every seam in the hull. The long gun barrel recoiled smoothly into the turret, the hydraulic cylinders absorbing the massive force, then returned to battery. For a moment, nobody moved. Earl felt his heart hammering against his ribs. Then the driver's hatch opened. A sergeant named Michael Romano climbed out, brushing dust from his coveralls. He was grinning. "She held us together," Romano shouted across the frozen ground. "Loud as hell in there, but she held on." Earl exhaled. He realized he had been holding his breath for what felt like minutes. General Bruce turned to the Ordnance Department officers. "I believe we should continue testing." They fired 47 more rounds that day. The chassis held. The gun performed flawlessly. Against test armor plates designed to simulate Tiger tank armor, penetration was confirmed at ranges exceeding 1,000 yards. At 1,500 yards, the 90mm round still penetrated over 4 inches of armor plate sufficient to defeat most German tanks from the front. The prototype had proven the fundamental concept. A 90mm gun could be mounted on a mobile tank destroyer chassis, but proving the concept and creating a combat-ready vehicle were different challenges entirely. Over the next 8 months, testing revealed numerous problems. The open turret, while necessary to save weight, left the crew dangerously exposed. In simulated combat exercises, referees repeatedly ruled that artillery fragments or small arms fire would have killed or wounded the exposed crew members. The ammunition storage in the rear bustle, while balancing the turret and providing necessary volume, created a critical vulnerability. A penetrating hit to the rear of the turret would almost certainly detonate the stored ammunition, destroying the vehicle and killing the entire crew instantly. The turret traverse was painfully slow. It took nearly 40 seconds to rotate the turret 180 degrees. Against fast-moving targets or in close combat, this sluggishness could be fatal. The vehicle's height over 9 feet made it difficult to conceal and easy for enemy gunners to spot. Earl went back to the drawing board. He could not eliminate these problems entirely. They were inherent compromises in the design, but he could mitigate them. Around the turret's open top, he added a raised armoured lip that provided limited protection against overhead fragmentation while still allowing the crew to operate. He redesigned the ammunition storage with blowout panels, thin armor plates, that would direct the force of an explosion upward and away from the crew compartment if the ammunition was hit. He upgraded the turret traverse motor and improved the gearing, cutting traverse time to approximately 20 seconds for 180 degrees. He redesigned the muzzle brake, the device at the end of the gun barrel that redirects propellant gases to reduce recoil, improving its efficiency by 15%. Each modification required testing. Each test revealed new problems or unexpected interactions between systems. Engineering is rarely a straight line from concept to completion. By September of 1943, the design had evolved through multiple iterations. The Army officially designated it the M36 and approved it for production. But they assigned it a low priority. The M10 tank destroyer was already in production and was considered adequate for the near term. M36 production would begin, but slowly, very slowly. The first production, M36, rolled off the assembly line at the Fisher Tank Arsenal in Grand Blanc, Michigan, in April of 1944. By that point, American armor was already fighting in Italy. The lessons of combat were already being learned in blood. The summer of 1944. Normandy, France. The hedgerow country of northwestern France is a nightmare for American armor. Centuries-old farming practices have divided the landscape into small fields, surrounded by dense hedgerows, thick walls of earth and vegetation, 4 to 6 feet high, often reinforced with stone. Each field is a potential fortress. Each hedgerow is a potential ambush site. German Panther and Tiger tanks dig into concealed positions behind the hedgerows, waiting for American columns to advance into killing zones. The German doctrine is simple and devastatingly effective. Let the Americans advance. Engage them at close range where German optical superiority and armor protection provide overwhelming advantage. Destroy the lead vehicles to block the road. Destroy the rear vehicles to prevent escape. Annihilate everything in between. The mathematics of these engagements are horrific. In some actions, German forces trade 1 Panther for 5 or 6 Shermans. The 2nd Armored Division loses 24 Sherman tanks in a single engagement near Saint-Lô on July 11th. Crew casualties in some tank battalions approached 300%, meaning that entire crews were being replaced 3 times over during the Normandy campaign. The replacement crews arrive young and terrified, knowing they are climbing into coffins that happen to have engines. Lieutenant Colonel James Taylor commands the 899th Tank Destroyer Battalion. His unit is equipped with M10 tank destroyers, the same basic vehicle that Earl modified to create the M36 prototype. They mount 3-inch guns. Against Panther tanks, the M10s are effective only at relatively close range or when maneuvering for flank shots against the thinner side armor. Against Tiger tanks, they are almost useless. The Tiger's frontal armor is too thick for the 3-inch gun to penetrate reliably at any practical combat range. On August 8th, near Mortagne, Taylor's unit engaged 5 Tiger tanks defending a ridgeline. The engagement lasts nearly 2 hours. The M10s maneuver constantly, trying to get into flanking positions where their guns might penetrate the Tiger's side armor. They succeed in destroying 1 Tiger. They lost 6 M10 tank destroyers. 11 men were killed. 17 are wounded. Taylor writes in his after-action report, "We are bringing knives to a gunfight. The enemy has weapons that outrange and outmatch ours. Our crews fight with tremendous courage, but courage cannot defeat physics. We need better guns." His report goes up the chain of command. Similar reports are arriving from other tank destroyer battalions, from tank battalions, from infantry divisions that rely on American armor for support. Where are the M36s? The answer comes back, still in production, limited numbers available. Maybe by October. The production delays are not the result of technical problems. The M36 design works. The delays are bureaucratic and logistical. Retooling factories to produce M36s instead of M10s requires time and resources. Sherman production remains the absolute priority. The generals in Washington are still convinced that overwhelming numbers of adequate tanks will win the war. Perhaps they are right, but the boys dying in Normandy hedgerows are paying the price for that calculation. September 25, 1944. The first M36 Jackson tank destroyers arrive at the front. The Army has officially named the vehicle after Confederate General Thomas Stonewall Jackson, continuing the tradition of naming American tank destroyers after American generals. The crews immediately start calling it the Jackson. Lieutenant Colonel Taylor's 899th Tank Destroyer Battalion receives 18 M36s, barely half their authorized strength, but the crews treat them like gold. Staff Sergeant Robert Early, who has been fighting in an M10 for 8 months, climbs into an M36 for the first time. The interior is cramped and smells of oil and steel and the rubber coating on electrical wires. The 90mm gun dominates the fighting compartment, its massive breech mechanism forcing the crew to work around it. But when Early looks down the gun tube, when he sees the size of the 90mm ammunition, he feels something he has not felt in months: hope. "I looked at that 90mm gun," he will write years later in a letter to his wife, "and I thought finally we have something that can fight back on equal terms." The crews train intensively for a week, learning the new gun's ballistics, practicing loading drills, familiarizing themselves with the different fire control procedures. Then they move up to the front. October 3rd, 1944, near Aachen, Germany. Baker Company of the 899th Tank Destroyer Battalion is supporting the 1st Infantry Division's advance into Germany. They are moving through open farmland east of Aachen, rolling terrain with scattered woods and small villages. The weather is overcast, with occasional rain. At 0945 hours, German armor was reported 2 kilometers ahead. The American column halts. Lieutenant James Bates, commanding a Sherman tank in the lead element, scans forward with his binoculars. 3 M36 Jacksons from the 899th are positioned 1,000 yards behind his Sherman, deployed in a slight depression that provides hull-down cover. Bates can see the long barrels of their 90mm guns elevated slightly above the ridgeline. At 0947 hours, a German Panther tank emerges from a tree line 300 yards ahead of Bates's position. The Panther's commander must see the American vehicles immediately. The long 75mm gun begins to traverse, searching for a target. Bates knows exactly what happens next. He has seen it happen to other crews. At this range, his Sherman's 75mm gun cannot penetrate the Panther's frontal armor. The sloped glacis plate and thick turret face will deflect his shells like raindrops, but the Panther's gun will cut through his Sherman's armor as if it were made of paper. He has perhaps 15 seconds. He orders his driver to reverse, trying to create distance, trying to buy time to maneuver or withdraw, or do anything except sit here and die. The Panther's turret stops traversing. The gun barrel is pointed directly at Bates's Sherman. Bates can see the dark circle of the muzzle. He opens his mouth to give another order, though he is not sure what order he can give that will matter. The Panther explodes. The detonation is massive, a fireball that engulfs the entire vehicle. The turret lifts 3 feet off the chassis, blown upward by the force of the ammunition cooking off inside, then crashes back down at an angle. Black smoke pours from every hatch and vision port. Bates stares, completely uncomprehending. His gun did not fire. He saw no American aircraft. He heard no artillery. Then he hears it. The sharp, distinctive crack of a 90mm gun firing from behind and above him. One of the M36 Jacksons, commanded by Sergeant First Class Harold Hightower, has fired from its position 1,000 yards behind the Sherman column. At that range, with a skilled gunner and good optics, the 90mm M3 gun can punch through even a Panther's frontal armor. Against the Panther's thinner side armor, which the Jackson gunner hit as the German tank rotated its turret, the 90mm round penetrated like a hot knife through butter. The German crew has no chance. The armor-piercing round punches through the side hull, penetrating the ammunition storage. The secondary explosion tears the Panther apart from the inside. 3 German tankers die instantly. One man, the radio operator, manages to crawl out of the driver's hatch. He is on fire. American infantrymen watch as he rolls on the ground, trying to extinguish the flames consuming his uniform. A medic runs forward. Bates climbs out of his Sherman on shaking legs. He walks back to Jackson's position. Sergeant Hightower is standing in the turret, his loader beside him, both men scanning for additional targets. "You saved my life," Bates says. Hightower glances down at him. The sergeant's face is smudged with powder residue from the gun firing in the open turret. "That's what this gun is for," Hightower says. "About damn time we got one that could do the job." Over the next 6 months, M36 Jacksons established themselves as the most effective American tank-killing vehicle of the European theatre. The 701st Tank Destroyer Battalion, the first unit to be fully equipped with M36S records, 36 confirmed kills of German heavy armour between October of 1944 and March of 1945. 23 Panthers, 11 Tigers, 2 King Tigers. They lose 9 M36S in return, a kill ratio dramatically better than any other American armoured vehicle achieved against German heavy tanks. The 899th Tank Destroyer Battalion, Taylor's unit, claims 41 confirmed heavy tank kills by war's end. Other units report similar success. The statistics validate Harley Earl's design. At ranges exceeding 1,000 yards, the M36 can engage German heavy tanks on equal terms. The gun that the Ordnance Department declared impossible to mount on a mobile chassis is killing Tigers from distances where the Tigers can barely identify their targets. But the M36 is not invincible. The open-topped turret remains a critical vulnerability. Artillery fragments kill or wound crew members who have no overhead protection. In urban fighting, German infantry drop grenades into open turrets from upper-story windows. Roof-dropped charges, satchel charges lowered on ropes from buildings onto passing vehicles are a constant threat in cities like Aachen and Cologne. On November 22, 1944, near Merode, Germany, an M36 commanded by Sergeant William Brewer was hit by an 88mm round from a concealed Tiger tank. The round penetrates the turret bustle, detonating the stored ammunition. The explosion is catastrophic. The turret is blown completely off the hull, landing 15 feet away. All 5 crew members are killed instantly. The burned-out hull smoulders for hours. Another M36, commanded by Lieutenant Philip Morrison, was destroyed on December 18th during the Battle of the Bulge. A German Panther firing from a concealed position at close range less than 200 yards puts a round through the Jackson's frontal hull. The round does not penetrate entirely, but its spalls fragments of the interior armour break off and ricochet around the fighting compartment at high velocity. Morrison loses an eye. His gunner and loader are killed. The driver and assistant driver escape. The open turret design also proves problematic in winter combat. December of 1944 is bitterly cold in the Ardennes. Temperatures drop below 0 Fahrenheit. Crews in enclosed Shermans suffer from the cold. Crews in open-topped Jacksons suffer more. They rig canvas tarps over the turret openings, but the tarps provide little insulation and must be removed before firing. Frostbite becomes a significant problem. Several crew members were evacuated with severe cold injuries to hands and faces. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Yet despite these vulnerabilities, the M36 proves its worth again and again. During the Battle of the Bulge, Germany's last major offensive in the West, M36 Jacksons played a crucial role in blunting the Panzer spearheads. On December 20th, near Bastogne, a platoon of 4 M36S from the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion engaged a column of German armour trying to break through to the encircled American forces. The engagement lasts 30 minutes. The Jacksons destroy 3 Panther tanks and 2 Panzer IV tanks from ranges between 800 and 1,200 yards. The German column withdraws. The road to Bastogne remains contested, but it does not fall. In January of 1945, During the Allied counteroffensive after the Bulge, M36S supported the advance into Germany. The flat, open terrain of the Rhine Valley favors long-range gunnery. Jacksons engage German tanks at ranges up to 1,500 yards distances, where the Sherman's gun is nearly useless, but where the M36's 90mm can still penetrate heavy armor. The psychological impact on German tank crews is significant. For the first time, German tankers face American guns that can kill them at ranges where they previously felt safe. After the war, interviews with captured German tank commanders reveal that they learned to identify American tank destroyers by silhouette and prioritized them as targets. A Sherman could be engaged at leisure. Jackson had to be destroyed immediately. By December of 1944, with the Battle of the Bulge raging and American forces desperate for every advantage, M36 production finally accelerated. The Army ordered production increased to 300 vehicles per month. Factories in Michigan and Pennsylvania run 24-hour shifts. Assembly lines that built M10 tank destroyers are converted. By war's end, in May of 1945, approximately 2,300 M36 Jacksons had been built. It is too few, too late. Had production begun in earnest in 1943, when Harley Earl first proved the design concept worked, thousands of additional M36S could have been in Europe for the Normandy landings. The entire Normandy campaign, with its horrific casualties among Sherman crews, might have unfolded differently if American tank destroyer battalions had been equipped with guns capable of reliably engaging Panthers and Tigers at long range. How many American boys died in Shermans and M10S because bureaucratic resistance and production priorities delayed the M36 for a year? The Army never releases those calculations. The numbers would be too painful. But the men who fought in Normandy, who struggled through the hedgerows knowing their 3-inch guns could not penetrate a Panther frontally, those men have their own estimate. In his memoir, published in 1968, Lieutenant Colonel James Taylor writes, "We received the M36 in September of 1944. We needed it in June. How many of my boys died in those 3 months because someone decided production priorities put a better gun at low priority? I will never know. But I see their faces." Harley Earl received a commendation from the Ordnance Department in June of 1945. It is a certificate suitable for framing, signed by a brigadier general whose name Earl does not recognize. The certificate thanks him for his valuable contributions to the war effort and commends his dedication and technical expertise. Earl receives no promotion. He receives no bonus. He receives no public recognition. His name does not appear in newspapers. No documentary films mention him. In the official Army histories of the tank destroyer program, his contribution is reduced to a single sentence in a footnote. Design modifications by civilian engineer H. Earl. After the war, Earl returns to civilian life. He goes back to designing industrial machinery in Pennsylvania, heavy presses, conveyor systems, mining, equipment. He avoids talking about his war work. When people ask what he did during the war, he says he was an engineer at Aberdeen. He does not elaborate. In 1967, a journalist researching a book on American armored vehicles tracks Earl down. The journalist has found references to Earl's work in declassified Ordnance Department files. He wants to interview Earl about the M36 development. Earl agrees to meet. The interview lasts 2 hours. The journalist takes extensive notes. Only a small portion of the interview appears in the published book, but the journalist's notes survive in an archive. In those notes, Earl is quoted as saying, "I am proud we built it. I am proud the boys who used it had a better chance of coming home. But I am frustrated, no. I am angry that it took so long to get there. A lot of boys died in the meantime because people in positions of authority could not admit they were wrong about what was possible. They said it could not be done. When I proved it could, they did not want to admit their analysis was incomplete. Institutional pride killed American soldiers. That is what I believe." Harley Earl died on March 14, 1974, in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. He is 70 years old. His obituary in the local newspaper mentions that he was a mechanical engineer who worked on military projects during World War II. It does not mention the M36. It does not mention the thousands of American tank destroyer crews who fought in vehicles designed around his impossible gun. At his funeral, one of the attendees is a retired Army sergeant named Robert Early, the same man who climbed into an M36 for the first time in September of 1944 and felt, for the first time in months, that he had a fighting chance. Early travelled from Ohio to attend. He never met Earl during the war. He learned of Earl's death from a newspaper article that mentioned his work on tank destroyers. "I wanted to pay respects," Early tells Earl's widow. "Your husband's design saved my life. Probably saved it a dozen times. I just wanted someone in his family to know that." The M36 Jackson continues in service long after World War II ends. The vehicle fought in Korea, where its 90mm gun proved highly effective against North Korean T-34-85 tanks, Soviet-designed medium tanks that North Korean forces employed in large numbers during the early months of the war. In July of 1950, near Daejeon, a platoon of M36s from the 78th Tank Battalion destroys 7 T-34-85 tanks in a single engagement, halting a North Korean advance. The Jackson's ability to engage enemy armour at long range proves as valuable in Korea's hills and valleys as it did in Europe's fields and forests. Surplus M36s are sold or given to Allied nations under military assistance programs. Yugoslavia received M36s in the 1950s and operated them until the 1990s. During the Yugoslav wars of the 1990s, M36 Jacksons, 50 years old by then, still saw combat. Grainy footage from the siege of Vukovar in 1991 shows an M36 firing at Serbian positions. Pakistan received M36s in the 1950s and operated them far longer than anyone expected. The last M36 in active military service with any nation was retired by Pakistan in 2016, 72 years, after Harley Earl proved the design could work. The basic principle Earl pioneered, mounting the most powerful available gun on a mobile, lightly armoured chassis, optimized for the gun rather than trying to fit the gun onto an existing design, became foundational to post-war tank destroyer and assault gun doctrine. The concept influences the design of vehicles like the American M18 Hellcat, the German post-war Kanonenjagdpanzer, and numerous other tank destroyers and assault guns developed during the Cold War. But Earl's real legacy is simpler and more human. Sometimes impossible just means difficult. Sometimes the only thing stopping us from solving a problem is the conviction that the problem cannot be solved. Sometimes institutional authority is wrong, and a stubborn engineer with a slide rule and a welding torch is right. The United States Army Ordnance Museum at Aberdeen Proving Ground, Maryland. An M36 Jackson sits in the main exhibition hall, its long 90mm gun angled slightly upward as if still scanning for targets across some long-ago battlefield. The vehicle is restored to pristine condition. The olive-drab paint is fresh. The white star on the hull is carefully stenciled. The tracks are clean, free of the mud and blood that once caked them. A placard beside the vehicle provides the basic information. Weight, 29 tons. Crew, 5 men. Main armament, 90mm, M, 3-gun. Maximum armour, 50mm. Production, approximately 2,300 vehicles between April 1944 and June 1945. Combat service, European theatre, Korean War, and various Allied nations through 2016. At the bottom of the placard, a single sentence. Design modifications by civilian engineer H. Earl, 1942 to 1943. That is the entirety of Harley Earl's recognition in the official record. One sentence, 14 words. If you stand next to the vehicle and look up at the massive 90mm gun so large, it seems impossible that it could be mounted on this relatively modest chassis, you can see the elegance of Earl's solution. The low-profile turret, the counterbalancing bustle, the carefully reinforced hull structure. Every element serves a purpose. Every compromise has a reason. You can also see something else if you know where to look. On the interior of the turret, visible if you peer through the open top, there are names scratched into the metal. Crew members who served in this particular vehicle, or vehicles like it. SGT Height Tower, in crude block letters. Early. Was here with a date. The 3rd of October 2044. We made it home without any name at all. These are the men who fought in Earl's impossible gun. These are the men who came home because an engineer refused to accept someone else's definition of impossible. The story of the M36 Jackson is not primarily a story about technology. It is a story about institutional failure and individual persistence. It is a story about the cost of bureaucratic caution and the value of stubborn belief in the face of expert consensus. In the spring of 1942, when the Ordnance Department declared that mounting a 90mm gun on a tank destroyer chassis was impossible, they were not being malicious. They were not incompetent. They were experienced engineers applying conventional analysis to a difficult problem. Their analysis was thorough, methodical, and logical. It was also incomplete. They asked whether the gun could fit on an existing chassis. They did not ask what chassis you would need to build to accommodate the gun. That distinction between fitting a gun to a chassis versus designing a chassis for a gun seems trivial. It is not. It represents a fundamental difference in engineering philosophy. One approach accepts constraints as immutable. The other approach treats constraints as variables to be managed. Harley Earl understood this distinction instinctively. His entire career in industrial engineering had been built on solving problems that conventional wisdom said could not be solved. When someone told him a particular machine could not handle a particular force, he did not accept that limitation. He asked what modifications would allow the machine to handle that force. When someone told him a structure would fail under a specific load, he did not abandon the project. He asked how to distribute that load across the structure differently. This was not optimism. It was not stubbornness for its own sake. It was a rigorous, disciplined approach to engineering that refused to accept the first answer when the first answer was impossible. But Earl's technical brilliance would have been irrelevant without General Bruce's willingness to bypass normal channels. Bruce had the authority to order a prototype built despite Ordnance Department objections. He had the institutional power to direct resources to Earl's project. He had the judgment to recognize that Earl's unorthodox approach might succeed where conventional analysis had failed. This combination, the stubborn engineer and the general willing to take a risk, created the M36. Without either man, the impossible gun would have remained impossible. The bureaucratic resistance Earl faced was not unusual. Large organizations, military organizations, especially develop procedures and hierarchies specifically to prevent untested ideas from disrupting established processes. This is generally wise. Most untested ideas fail. Most unconventional approaches produce inferior results. The Ordnance Department's caution was based on decades of experience with engineers who promised revolutionary designs that never worked as advertised. But this institutional conservatism has a cost. When the Ordnance Department rejected Earl's preliminary designs in September of 1942, they delayed the M36 program by approximately 1 year. When production priority was set to low, even after the design was approved, another 6 months vanished. Those 18 months from September 1942 to March 1944 represent the gap between when the M36 could have been in production and when it actually entered production. By June of 1944, when American forces landed in Normandy, the United States could theoretically have had thousands of M36 Jacksons in service if production had begun immediately after Earl proved the concept in January of 1943. Instead, the first M36S reached the front in late September of 1944, 4 months after D-Day, 3 months after the worst of the Normandy hedgerow fighting. How many American armored vehicle crew members died in those 4 months? The Army maintains detailed casualty statistics, but calculating deaths specifically attributable to inadequate anti-tank capability is impossible. Too many variables. Too many unknowns. But the men who fought in Normandy, who engaged Panthers and Tigers with 3-inch guns and 75mm guns. Those men have no doubt. In their memoirs, in their letters home, in their post-war interviews, the same theme appears repeatedly. We needed better guns. We needed them sooner. Lieutenant Colonel James Taylor, who commanded the 899th Tank Destroyer Battalion, spent the last 30 years of his life, he died in 1998, speaking to military audiences about the lessons of World War II. His presentations included a section on the M36. He would show photographs of burned-out M10 tank destroyers. Then he would show photographs of M36 Jacksons. Then he would say, "The difference between these vehicles is about 18 months of bureaucratic delay. The difference for the men who fought in them was the difference between dying and living. When someone tells you something is impossible, make damn sure they are right before you accept that answer, because the cost of being wrong is not measured in money or time. It is measured in lives." Taylor was not a man given to dramatic statements. He was a career army officer, measured and professional. But on this subject, on the subject of the M36's delayed deployment, he was uncompromising. He believed that institutional caution had killed American soldiers. He said so publicly and repeatedly. The Army never officially responded to Taylor's criticisms. The Ordnance Department's post-war reports on the M36 program make no mention of the production delays or the reasons for them. The official history is sanitized, bureaucratic, empty of the human cost. But the unofficial history, the history recorded in letters and memoirs and veterans' testimonies, tells a different story. Robert Early, the sergeant who climbed into an M36 in September of 1944, survived the war. He came home to Ohio, married his sweetheart, raised 3 children, and worked for 37 years as a machinist. He died at 2009 at the age of 86. Before he died, he recorded an oral history interview for a veterans project. In that interview, he talked about his experience in the M36. "When we got the Jacksons," he said, "it was like someone finally gave us a fair fight. For 8 months, we had been going up against German heavy tanks with guns that could not penetrate their armor frontally. We had to maneuver, had to get flank shots, and had to take risks. Then we got the M36, and suddenly we could engage Panthers from the front, at range. We did not have to play games. We did not have to be heroes. We could just be soldiers with the right equipment. I think about the boys who died in the M10S before we got the Jacksons. I think about them a lot. They were just as brave as we were, just as skilled. But they had worse guns. That should not be the difference between living and dying, but it was." Early's voice in the recording is quiet, measured. He is not angry. He is sad. There is a difference. The technical specifications of the M36 Jackson tell part of the story. 90mm M3 gun, muzzle velocity, 2,700 feet per second. Armor penetration, 6.3 inches at 1,000 yards against vertical armor plate. Maximum effective range, 2,000 yards. Rate of fire, approximately 6 rounds per minute with a trained crew. These numbers are important. They represent the quantifiable superiority the M36 had over earlier American tank destroyers and medium tanks. But the numbers do not capture the psychological dimension. When American tank destroyer crews received M36s, they were not just getting a better gun. They were getting hope. They were getting the belief that they could survive. That belief matters in combat. Soldiers who believe they have a fighting chance take risks differently than soldiers who believe they are doomed. They make better tactical decisions. They fight more effectively. Morale, that intangible quality that military theorists struggle to quantify, improved measurably in units that received M36s. After-action reports from late 1944 and early 1945 consistently mention improved crew performance and willingness to engage enemy armor. The M36 did not just kill German tanks more effectively, it made American crews more effective at their jobs. Harley Earl never spoke publicly about this psychological dimension. He was an engineer, not a psychologist. He thought in terms of forces and structures and tolerances. But in that 1967 interview, the one where he expressed frustration about the production delays, he came close. The boys who used the M36, he said, they wrote me letters after the war. Not many, but some. They said thank you. They said the gun saved their lives. I appreciated those letters more than any commendation the army gave me, because those boys understood what I was trying to do. The army saw the M36 as a weapon system, a piece of equipment. I saw it as life insurance for 5-man crews. Every vehicle that got to the front was 5 boys who might come home. Earl kept those letters in a box in his study. When he died, his widow donated the box to the Army Ordnance Museum. The letters are filed in the museum's archives, rarely accessed, slowly yellowing. They are handwritten, most of them. The penmanship is often poor. These were tankers and mechanics, not clerks. The spelling is sometimes creative, but the message is consistent. Thank you for the gun. Thank you for giving us a fighting chance. One letter, from a sergeant whose name is illegible due to water damage on the paper, includes this passage. Sir, I do not know if you will remember me. I was part of the test crew at Aberdeen in January 43. I fired the first test shot from the prototype. You were standing outside, watching. I remember thinking, if this thing breaks, we are all going to have a bad day. But it did not break. It worked. I went to Europe with the 899th. I fought in an M36 from October 44 until the end. I am writing because I want you to know your gun saved my life at least 4 times that I can count. Maybe more that I do not know about. I am home now. I am going to marry my girl. I am going to have a life. Because you built a gun that worked. Thank you. The M36 was not a perfect vehicle. The open turret remained a vulnerability throughout its service life. The relatively thin armor, maximum 50 mm on the turret face, meant that the Jackson could not survive hits from German heavy tank guns at close range. The slow turret traverse was a persistent problem in fluid combat situations. The high profile made concealment difficult, but perfection was not the goal. The goal was to give American crews a gun that could kill German heavy tanks at range. In that specific, crucial objective, the M36 succeeded completely. The question that haunts the M36's history is not whether it worked. The question is why it took so long to get to the front. The technical challenges were real, but not insurmountable. Earl proved that in less than a year, working with a small team and limited resources, the production challenges were significant, but manageable. American industry was performing far more complex feats of production throughout the war. The real obstacle was institutional, the Ordnance Department's initial impossible verdict. The low production priority, even after the design, was approved. The reluctance to disrupt Sherman production. The conservative, risk-averse approach that prioritized established systems over unproven designs. Each of these obstacles was rational in isolation. Taken together, they killed American soldiers. This is not a melodramatic claim, it is a factual observation. Every month that passed between Earl's proof of concept in January 1943 and the first M36S reaching the front in September 1944 was a month when American tank destroyer crews engaged German heavy tanks with inadequate weapons. Some of those crews died. Not all of them, not even most of them, but some. The exact number is unknowable, but it is not zero. Those deaths were not inevitable. They were the result of choices made by men in offices far from the front lines, choices about production priorities, choices about risk tolerance, choices about whether to trust an unconventional engineer's unconventional solution. In any large organization, these kinds of choices happen constantly. Most of them have no dramatic consequences. Some of them do. The story of the M36 Jackson is a case study in how institutional caution, how the reasonable, prudent, careful approach can have catastrophic human consequences. It is also a case study in how one individual, if stubborn enough and skilled enough and lucky enough to find a sponsor with authority, can overcome institutional resistance and save lives. Both lessons are important. Both are true. Both are uncomfortable. The veteran community's response to the M36 was overwhelmingly positive. Men who fought in Jacksons remembered them fondly. Unit associations for tank destroyer battalions featured the M36 prominently in their newsletters and reunions. The 899th Tank Destroyer Battalion Association, which held annual reunions until 2012, always displayed a photograph of an M36 at their registration table. But there was also bitterness, not toward the vehicle itself, but toward the circumstances of its deployment. Veterans of the Normandy campaign, particularly those who fought in M10 tank destroyers during the hedgerow battles, asked a question that never received a satisfactory answer. Why did we not have these guns in June? The Army's official histories do not address this question directly. They present the M36's development as a normal progression of weapon system improvement. Design, testing, production, deployment. The timeline is presented as inevitable, as if each step followed naturally from the previous step without any possibility of acceleration or delay. This sanitized narrative ignores the human decisions that shaped that timeline. The decision to reject Earl's initial designs, the decision to assign low production priority, the decision to maintain Sherman production at maximum capacity even when better anti-tank vehicles were available. These were choices, not inevitabilities. Different choices would have produced different outcomes. Better outcomes. Outcomes where more American boys came home. In 2014, a group of military historians organized a symposium at the Army War College on World War II weapons development. One panel focused on the M36 Jackson. The panel included technical experts, Army historians, and 2 surviving veterans who had served in M36 crews. During the question period, a young Army captain asked the veterans, "If you could change one thing about the M36 program, what would it be?" One of the veterans, a man in his late 80s, a former staff sergeant, answered immediately, "I would not change the vehicle. The vehicle was fine. I would change when we got it. We should have had it on D-Day. We should have had it in Normandy. A lot of boys died in M10s and Shermans who should not have died. They died because someone decided it was more important to keep production lines running smoothly than to get better guns to the front. That is what I would change." For several seconds. Then the moderator thanked the veteran and moved to the next question. The Army's official report on the symposium does not include this exchange. The unofficial transcript maintained by the veterans' organization that helped organize the event does. Context matters. The United States in 1942 and 1943 was fighting a global war on multiple fronts. Production capacity was finite. Every resource allocated to M36 production was a resource not available for something else. Sherman tanks, artillery pieces, transport ships, ammunition. The logistics of global war are staggeringly complex. The Ordnance Department's caution was not unreasonable in this context. Unproven designs could fail catastrophically. Production disruptions could create shortages. Resources committed to one system might be desperately needed for another. Every decision involved trade-offs. Every choice had consequences. The people making these decisions were not villains. They were professionals trying to manage impossible complexity under extreme pressure. This context is important. It explains the decisions that delayed the M36, but it does not excuse them, because ultimately, the Ordnance Department was wrong. Earl's design worked. It could have been in production a year earlier. American crews could have had 90mm guns in Normandy. The trade-offs the Ordnance Department thought they were making production efficiency versus unproven technology were not the real trade-offs. The real trade-off was American lives versus institutional caution. That is the uncomfortable truth at the heart of the M36 story. Reasonable people, making reasonable decisions based on reasonable assumptions, killed American soldiers through excessive caution, not through malice, not through incompetence, through an abundance of caution that turned out to be unwarranted. The M36 Jackson sits in museums now. Aberdeen, Fort Benning, the National World War II Museum in New Orleans. Several dozen vehicles survive, preserved by collectors and military museums around the world. They are historical artifacts, curiosities from an era when tank destroyers were a distinct category of armored vehicle. Visitors walk past them, reading the placards, taking photographs. Most visitors do not know Harley Earl's name. Most do not know about the Ordnance Department's impossible verdict. Most do not know about the 18-month delay between proof of concept and deployment. They see a tank destroyer. They see a gun. They see a museum piece. They do not see the human story encoded in that particular configuration of steel and engineering, the low-profile turret that saved weight, the counterbalancing bustle that made the gun viable, the reinforced chassis that distributed recoil forces. Each element represents a choice Earl made, a problem he solved, a conventional wisdom he challenged. Each element represents his stubborn insistence that impossible was not an acceptable answer. And each element, ultimately, represents American lives saved. 5-man crews who came home because their vehicle could kill German tanks at 1,000 yards. Families who were not shattered because a stubborn engineer refused to accept expert consensus. Harley Earl was not a hero in the conventional sense. He did not storm beaches or charge machine gun nests. He did not win medals for valor or command troops in battle. He sat at a drafting table. He ran calculations. He argued with bureaucrats. He built a prototype in a converted warehouse. This is not the stuff of war movies. It does not make for dramatic storytelling, but it saved lives all the same. Perhaps more lives, in aggregate, than many Medal of Honor recipients saved. The calculus is impossible and distasteful, but it is worth considering. How many American armored vehicle crew members died between June and September of 1944 who would have survived if their vehicles had mounted 90mm guns? How many of those deaths could have been prevented if Earl's design had been approved and prioritized in early 1943? The numbers are unknowable, but they are not zero. Earl knew this. In his later years, in the few interviews he gave, he returned repeatedly to the theme of the production delay. He was not angry, exactly. He was sad. He was frustrated. He felt that he had done his job, had proven the impossible was possible, and that the system had then failed to act on that proof with sufficient urgency. He was right. Thank you for reading. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.